Also, this is the company.
All right, so now we're going to read out the dedication together. So we, as residents of the Minidoka Relocation Center in Hunt, Idaho, take pleasure in dedicating this book to the America of tomorrow and reaffirm our faith in the principles and ideals of the founders of the United States. In dedicating this book to the greater America to come, when victory has been won over the forces of aggression and greed, it is our firm conviction that a nation so great, so powerful, and so wise, whose very foundation of government and principles of living is based on equality and justice, will solve for domestic racial problems in a just and equitable manner. This America, whose greatest strength is the determination of her people to uphold the democratic principles of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, will stand as a shining example to all the world in demonstrating that the people of all nations, all races, and all colors can live happily together, united by a bond of mutual respect, true understanding, and love of freedom.
We have every confidence that this nation of ours will lead the way towards a post-war peace, which will bring to all everlasting security based upon those principles of freedom, equality, justice, and humanity, which so many of our sons and brothers are fighting and dying to uphold. May we dedicate this book to the land of the free and the home of the brave, where the Star-Spangled Banner shall wave in triumph, to a truly free and democratic America, where men shall be judged by their actions, not by their race, color, or creed, to our homeland and the homeland of our children, the United States of America.
Now, there's something we'd like to emphasize with this declaration. So it was written in the middle of the Japanese Americans' imprisonment. So the future was uncertain. There were many consequences that they weren't sure of. They didn't really know what was going to happen, but they still held these strong beliefs. So here are a table of contents for today's presentations. We have context, event, life in the camps, and after. And so now we're going to go into a little bit of the context. So this is really talking about major Japanese immigration to the United States. So it started in the 19th century, or significant immigration started, and it was because of adverse economic conditions in Japan. So they had a lot of poverty in their economy, and there were reports of better economic status in the United States. So there were a lot of sayings that America was made of gold or painted of gold. So a lot of people wanted to come for a better life. So 70% lived in California because they immigrated to California originally. And because of that, that's kind of where anti-Japanese groups and legislations were created, which is why this really mainly targeted the West Coast, because this is where most of the immigrants were living. So they were excluded from political, social, and economic affairs. They were major targets of California's politics because they were minorities, and that meant that they were easy to target. Local labor groups with major anti-Japanese projects started to arise, and they started to become more popular, and protests to reenact Chinese Exclusion Act, but with all Mongolian labor. So they pretty much just wanted to stop all Japanese immigration.
So now we're going to go into some anti-Japanese sentiments at the time. So there was a lot of effort to prohibit land ownership by Japanese immigrants. And this was a huge impact because many of them were farmers. And these were very harsh measures against them, which caused them to not be able to flourish economically. Furthermore, eventually these future land purchases were actually barred, and this became the actually most restrictive land law and was supported by these following groups, which clearly shows that there was a lot of support for such an anti-Japanese law. So there was also a lot of negative portrayal throughout the media using newspapers, movies, etc. And you can see some examples on the right-hand side over there. There was also some organizations formed, such as the Japanese Exclusion League. This league wanted Japanese exclusion and used legislation, boycotting, and propaganda to get their way. By 1908, it had over 100,000 members and 238 affiliated groups, showing just how popular it was at the time. There was also a lot of segregation targeted towards those of Japanese descent, removing Japanese students to an Oriental school. And you can also see on the side over there, there was segregation in neighborhoods as well. The Japanese Exclusion League was quoted saying, "Our children should not be placed in any position where their youthful impressions may be affected by association with pupils of the Mongolian race."
So this is where we kind of talk about the 5 goals of California. So because of all these anti-Japanese ideas and laws, a lot of ideas started to form, and they created 5 goals that they wanted to execute. So the first one was the cancellation of the Gentleman's Agreement. So if you don't know, the Gentleman's Agreement was really just an agreement to ease political tensions between the United States and Japan, and they wanted to terminate that. Their second was that they wanted prohibition against further immigration from Japan. So they pretty much wanted to stop all immigration from Japan. So they didn't want any more Japanese immigrants coming into the United States. Second, they also wanted to prohibit against the entry of picture brides. So if you don't know, picture bride is really when people get married based on matchmakers. So they'll send for photos of the bride and the groom. And it was really just a way to immigrate to the United States because the United States already had some immigration restrictions. So if you had family, they were allowed to immigrate. So getting married meant that you would have work family and then people would be able to immigrate. So they were pretty much saying no more picture brides. Third, they wanted to confirm that Asians should be forever barred from American citizenship. So that means that no matter how long you live here, you will never be able to be a citizen. And fourth is that they wanted the Constitution to provide that no child born in the United States should become an American citizen unless both parents were of a race eligible for citizenship. So that meant that their kids would not be able to be citizens either. So this is the Munson report. So we just want to clarify that the Munson report happened before Pearl Harbor happened, before the bombing of Pearl Harbor. So the Munson report was an intelligence report on Japanese Americans on the West Coast specifically, because we've already talked about how most Japanese immigrants immigrated to the West Coast. So it was filed by businessman Curtis B. Munson, who was actually commissioned by the State Department because the government wanted more intelligence on these immigrants. So pretty much he would stay a week in districts on the West Coast and he would just go around interviewing them and living with them and seeing how their lives kind of played out. And his conclusion was that Japanese Americans presented no security risks. So that meant that they were relatively not loyal to Japan. And he even said foreigners to Japan because most of them hadn't even been to Japan before. However, even though it was commissioned by the state then chose to ignore this report and pretty much just decided to go ahead with the plan anyways.
So now we're going to go into the actual event of Pearl Harbor and then the starting of the evacuation of the Japanese Americans. So we're starting first with on December 7, 1941 of the attack on Pearl Harbor. So as many of you likely know, Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor caused many people to die. In fact, 2,403 Americans, and this eventually led to the US's entry into the World War II. Due to the surprise nature of the attack, there was a lot of fear that there would be another surprise attack. And as a result, a lot of anti-Japanese sentiment, as we just spoken, was already prevalent in the United States, became amplified. This was especially due to the large presence of Japanese Americans on the West Coast, just as Amy said, posing, quote unquote, a security risk. And there was, of course, suspicions of Japanese Americans remaining loyal to Japan, even though, as we just seen with the Munson report, this was not true whatsoever. The media further perpetuated this, saying a viper is nonetheless a viper wherever the egg is hatched. So a Japanese American born of Japanese parents grows up to be a Japanese, not an American. This is implying that Japanese are perpetual foreigners and that they will always be loyal to Japan despite being American from birth.
So the FBI began to target Japanese Americans only hours after Pearl Harbor. And we want you to know that this list of the people that they wanted to take in was already made long before Pearl Harbor. So this kind of really amplifies the fact that there were anti-Japanese sentiments long before the Pearl Harbor attack. It's always been around. So pretty much hours after, they rounded up 1,291 Japanese Americans, and they were arrested with all their assets frozen. So they lost their homes and their money, and they were pretty much transferred to camps, so they couldn't inform their families at all. So they pretty much just disappeared, and they were separated for years from their families. So they also searched the homes illegally because they had no warrants or anything that allowed them to do so, and seized items determined to be contraband.
So here's a poem by a Japanese immigrant that was taken through this FBI seizure. And he said, "I bid farewell to the faces of my sleeping children as I am taken prisoners into the cold night rain. There is no fence high up in the sky, the evening crows into the endless horizon." This poem just shows how much pain there was at being separated from their families without even a goodbye.
So now this is our second thing. On February 19th, 1942, President Roosevelt signed the Executive Order 9066, allowing the removal of any person by the military. So Executive Order 9066. So this is pretty much saying, so it said that any person could be removed, but they were mostly just targeting Japanese Americans. So, and something that a lot
wow.
of people don't know is that Canada and Mexico actually did the same thing. They also had concentration camps for Japanese Americans. Canada removed 21,000 of its residents of Japanese descendants from the coast, and Mexico removed 2,264 people of Japanese ancestry. So you
Yeah.
can kind of
It's
see how
related
much
to
of
this.
influence the United States has.
9066.
Yeah.
So John DeWitt was actually someone who kind of created the idea of these concentration camps and military zones. So DeWitt was the leader of the Western Defense Committee. And because these Japanese Americans were posed as security risks, he decided to create his own ideas. So he wanted protection of the Pacific coast. So he created military zones. And his original plan was actually to detain Italians, Germans, and Japanese, but rounding up Americans or white people of European descent was not popular. So, but because anti-Japanese sentiments was already very common, it was really easy to round them up. There was no public complaint against rounding up Japanese Americans. So what he did in order to go through his plan is he prepared a lot of reports saying that they were sabotaging the army and that they were working for Japan. And in one of his reports, he actually said that they were damaging power lines, but it turned out to just be cattle damaging the power lines. So this is a quote that he said: "The Japanese race is an enemy race."
So now we're going to be going into where the War Relocation Authority was established to oversee the actual relocation of the Japanese Americans. So the War Relocation Authority was essentially set up just to administer the plans for the relocation of Japanese Americans. It was originally supposed to be led by a man named Eisenhower. However, he resigned in protest as he believed that they were incarcerating innocent people, which they were. There was also a lot of racist resistance from the state governors who ran the states that these camps were planned to be operating because they believed that the Japanese would, quote unquote, never leave, and demanded that instead the Japanese Americans be locked up rather than transferred to these camps in their states.
So now this is our final thing for part 2 of this. So the first civilian exclusion order is issued and families are given 1 week to prepare for removal from their homes. So evacuation. So pretty much anyone with 1/16 of Japanese blood was to be evacuated. So that meant over 17,000 children under 10 were evacuated. And can you imagine the government saying that these children were spies for Japan and that they were security risks? That also included several thousand elderly and disabled who were evacuated, and 2/3 of the people evacuated were American citizens. So how they did it is that families received 6 days of notice to dispose of all of their belongings outside of what they could carry. So that meant that they usually had to sell their homes, their businesses, and most of their assets at a fraction of what they were worth, because they only had a few days to do so. So they couldn't get what it was actually worth. And most of them were unsure of when or if they would ever return. So there was panic. So this is just a photo of the evacuation. You can see that most of them could not bring most of their belongings. And as a matter of fact, if you see around the room with all of the instructions to all persons of Japanese ancestry, they weren't allowed to bring their pets either. So that most of them either had to abandon their pets or give them to a neighbor. So this is a quote from an anonymous old farmer who said, "They took my boy to the army and now they take my other children to a concentration camp." So really, most of the people are obviously not loyal to Japan, and most of them have actually fought for America, but still they were still detained. Here is a photo. Now, to give you a little bit of context, this was during the evacuation. So the store owner is actually someone of Japanese descent, and he was obviously protesting all of the detainment by writing and putting a sign over his store that said, "I am an American," and he ended up being removed to a concentration camp. So does anyone want to share how they feel about this?
It continues. It continues the sentiment.
The whole perpetual foreigner thing, like, I think it still continues where Asian Americans still feel like when they say I'm an American, it's questioned.
And I think it's so important they said, "I am an American." And I feel like this really showed that like the people they were detaining, these people were Americans. They were not some like foreigner or like somebody like loyal to Japan. They were Americans and they were born on American soil and they did not deserve any of this treatment, nor does anyone at all. So now we're going to look at the assembly center. So essentially before they were moved to the concentration camps, Japanese Americans were first put in the assembly centers, which were usually a bit like closer to their home than the concentration camps were. So these assembly centers were often unsuitable for human habitation because they were put in like horse stalls, livestock pavilions, so on, which are obviously not right for humans to live in. There was also a lot of food shortages and a huge lack of sanitation. In Oregon, 3,000 people lived in a livestock pavilion.
Oh.
In the Santa Anita Assembly Center, 8,000 people lived in horse stalls with dirt floors. You can imagine just how crowded and unsanitary this was and how inhumane these conditions were for these people. In the end, a riot actually broke out due to the insufficient rations and the overcrowding in this assembly center. As you can see, these conditions were extremely inhumane and awful for these people that were forced to live in here.
So to continue with assembly centers, so there was work offered to the evacuees, but they were paid relatively little or nothing at all. So they kind of created their own communities in a sense. So they had jobs like doctors, teachers, factory workers, and seasonal farmers. And from these assembly centers, the Japanese Americans would then be transferred to concentration camps. So this was kind of the first step in their evacuation.
So now we will be moving on into life in the camps. So these were the geographic locations of the camps, and there were 10 in total. They were primarily located in the western interior of the US. And just before we go into something else, I want you to consider the locations of all these camps. Just in Colorado and Arizona, in places where it's extremely cold or extremely hot. As we go into the next slide, I want you to think about the effects that this can have on the Japanese Americans living in these concentration camps under such extreme weather conditions.
So for the living conditions, so several families were squeezed into small barracks. So pretty much in these places, there was no heating or there was no cooling. So if you were in a place that was extremely hot, a lot of them would just have to deal with it, and they were given no help in that kind of sense because they had uninsulated homes. They were furnished with only cots and coal burning stoves, so they had no luxuries there. They were given the bare minimum because the government didn't want to spend any more money either. They had shared facilities like bathrooms, laundry, mess halls, and there were very limited resources. So there was little hot water and food shortages because most of these camps were in very isolated areas that were more inland of the United States, so that they were off the coast and no longer security risks. And one of the main problems with these places is how unsanitary there was, and also how there was little medical care and aid. They didn't bring doctors out. They didn't have any medications for these people. If they were sick, they would either just have to go through with it, and they were pretty much given no help. So, and because of that, a lot of illnesses spread around these camps very quickly because everyone was living together in cramped living quarters. So the Japanese Americans were also constantly surrounded by barbed wire fences and guards patrolling the camps. So if anyone tried to leave, their orders would be to shoot, but as we see later on, most of them were trying to leave and guards would sometimes shoot anyways. So this is kind of the layout of one of the camps. So you can see that they have the living conditions up at the top, and then the rest of it is just recreation grounds and space. And around them is just barbed wire. So this was kind of one of their layouts for the camps.
And here are some more photos of the camps. And as you can see over here, that's the barbed wire there. And you can also see in the other just how many people were crowded into these camps with like so many people here and here shown. So despite all the hardships that they had, these Japanese Americans still built communities and towns within these concentration camps, trying to bring some positivity throughout all this. They made schools, governing councils, churches, farms, newspapers, and fire and police departments. High school students had band, sports teams, clubs, and even senior prom and student council, as well as yearbooks being made. And children often played sports and arts and crafts. And as you can see over here, some young women are playing volleyball and some boys are playing baseball.
So pretty much the loyalty test. So in 1943, a loyalty test was administered to Japanese Americans. So this was set by the government to test if they were still loyal to Japan or not, even though they never were. So they were asked to reject allegiance to the Japanese emperor, and they were asked whether or not they were willing to serve in the US military. So we can kind of see that the consequences were unknown. No one knew what would happen if they said yes or no to any of these questions, and it caused a lot of this concern within the community. So pretty much two things happened, and these are both different kinds of patriotism. A lot of Japanese said no because they never were affiliated to the emperor, so why would they have to prove something like that? And another group chose to serve. So the no-no boys were sent to Tule Lake. So the no-no boys were people who said no to question 28 of whether or not they were loyal to the emperor, and they were sent to a vicious and cruel environment where they endured inhumane conditions, and pretty much others enlisted in armed forces to prove their innocence. So you can see that a lot of them served and a lot of them fought in wars for the America just to prove that they were indeed Americans. And there were 400, the 442nd Regimental Combat Team was the most decorated unit of its size in the United States history.
So there was a lot of violence and human rights violations in these camps. So to start with, in the New Mexico camps, prisoners were delivered in trains and forced to march 2 miles at night to reach the camp. And also on another occasion, 2 elderly, disabled Japanese Americans were shot and killed because guards claimed they were trying to escape from the camp. However, testimony said that the 2 men weren't trying to escape. They were likely just trying to walk around. And as you can see, they're elderly and disabled. They likely were not trying to get out because it probably would have been a failure anyway. As for the Topaz Relocation Center, a 63-year-old prisoner was shot and killed for walking near the perimeter of the fence. Just like with these 2 elderly disabled Japanese Americans up here, again, there was like this huge human rights violation of killing somebody, especially someone so elderly that likely was not trying to escape or posing any harm. There's also another couple that was shot for simply strolling near the fence.
So some more examples of human rights violations was that in a certain relocation center, so 6 white men actually beat a Japanese person, Fred Toyama, and he was pretty much a leader for a certain league known as the Japanese American Citizens League. So they were kind of advocating for their own rights and pushing for the rights of Japanese Americans. And however, they blamed another Japanese American for the assault, despite him being innocent. And when a crowd came to demand his release, incarcerating an innocent person, the police tear gassed the crowd. And James Ito and others were wounded, and some died days later due to complications.
And as we said before about the Two Lakes Recreation Center, this was where the no-no boys, or people that said no to both questions, were sent. So in here, there was a ton of human rights violations. There were many protests and strikes over food shortages and unsafe conditions, yet many were killed by guards in these protests. There were also beatings, and on one occasion, people were forced to stand outdoors for hours in snowy conditions. And an infant actually fell into scalding water, and yet there was a refusal to take a child, out of concentration camps to go to hospital for help. And in the end, this child actually died. And I'm sure this is only one out of many occasions of this happening. You have to consider, this is a child. There was no way this child could have been any danger at all. And yet they still refused to take this child out of the camp and maybe save their life. In the end, overall, 1,862 people died of these camps, mostly due to health complications, as we said before, because there was little medical aid in the camps, which were further exacerbated by the malnutrition and the facility that lost proper protection against the extreme weather we were talking about before.
So on the East Coast, as you said, most of the camps were situated on the West Coast. So the East Coast, some people were moved to camps, but most on the East Coast were primarily under house arrest. So that pretty much meant that under no circumstance, no matter if there's an emergency, a fire, anything, they were not allowed to leave their homes. So what that meant is that they relied on the government to supply them with food, water, medications, and other needed resources. However, sometimes government officials would often forget about those under house arrest, and they would go days without supplies, starving.
So now we're going to go into what happened after the camps, after the Japanese Americans were released. So in the end, 127,000 people were in prison in these concentration camps for 3 or more years until the end of the war.
So here's the redress movement, which was an effort to obtain the reinstitution of civil rights, an apology and/or some kind of compensation from the United States governments for the years that they took away from the Japanese Americans when they were forced into those camps. So early campaigns emphasized violation of constitutional rights because, as we have already talked about all the human rights violations within the camps, the lost property, as many people lost millions of dollars of their assets, and the repeal of anti-Japanese legislation. Activists linked the wartime detention camps to contemporary racist and colonial policies, and later campaigns, there were 3 organizations that pursued the redress in court and in Congress. So this did lead to reparations. And there's one thing I want to make clear, that when Congress apologized and gave an official acknowledgement, their words were, acts were motivated by racial injustice, wartime hysteria, and a failure of political leadership. So not a single person from any of these camps were ever convicted of being a spy or working for the Japanese government. So reparations. So the last camp closed in March 1946. President Gerald Ford officially repealed the Executive Order 9066 in 1976. And in 1988, Congress issued a formal apology. I do want to make it clear that after the camp closed, it took many decades to actually get the reparations and apologies from Congress. As you can see, the large gap between the actual formal apology and when the last camp closed. So the Civil Liberties Act of 1988 gave $20,000 each to over 80,000 Japanese for the treatment they endured, which wasn't nearly enough for the years of their lives that was taken away.
So after they were released from the camps, many were unable to actually reclaim their old homes because the governments had opened. So in the end, a lot of them lost about 75% of their property, and the government had to actually open areas just for the Japanese Americans to live in because they had lost their previous properties. There's also a lot of fear of violence and discrimination amongst the Japanese Americans, obviously due to their extremely awful treatment in the concentration camps. And the suicide rate among those held in the camps jumped by as much as four times pre-war levels. They were also unable to recover financially at all because economic losses were estimated to be about as high as 6.2 billion. And residents also lost about 400 million in property since their incarceration. Clearly, they lost everything from these concentration camps, going back to essentially nothing and having to rebuild from scratch. A Japanese American said, "But when we came out of the camp, that's when I realized that being in camp, that being Japanese American was something shameful." Furthermore, after the camp, many had actually applied to expatriation or repatriation to Japan due to stresses, and in the end, 8,000 left the country. However, many of them were going to Japan despite not knowing any Japanese, having lived in America their whole life. And so, through this, and also because Japan was also suffering due to having just lost World War II, this meant that many of them were exploring a very new and unknown environment where they had no family members that were already there and no help whatsoever. And also Issei, which were the Japanese Americans that first immigrated to the US, also were unable to find work because they were too old at this point. And the concentration camp had taken away the years of their life where they would be able to find work the best. You can also see over here that there's a chart of the lasting economic impact of the internment camps, of the concentration camps throughout each one.
So one thing we really wanted to emphasize is that despite all these struggles, the Japanese Americans did begin to reestablish themselves and their lives. However, it did take years upon years of rebuilding to finally gain some control of their lives back. So I just want you guys to understand how hard this was to really find jobs, find work again, have enough money, get their property back. It took a long time, but they were able to rebuild themselves. And a quote that we found that was really powerful and something that we wanted to close this presentation with is that to you, it was a history story. To me, it was my life. I think that's a really important emphasis that these were real people living in these camps. They had feelings, emotions, they had families that they had to look after, and yet the United States government still detained them on nothing. They had no evidence of them being spies or lured to Japan. These were real people.
And now we would like to move on to the main event of today and introduce today's speaker, Japanese American concentration camp survivor, David Sakura.
Okay, so Ellie, let me start with the slide that's on the screen. And it's a slide showing the map of Japan. And it shows the village of Suwano, where my grandfather was born in 1869. And he migrated to Seattle, Washington in 1898 when he was still in his 20s. In the next slide, my grandfather sent for a picture bride, and my grandmother arrived, and my grandmother arrived in 1900, and by 1920, they had built a family of some 9 children. My father is sitting in the front row, and there were 4 other children still to arrive. But my grandfather passed away in 1919, leaving my grandmother fairly destitute. But before my grandfather passed away, he asked his son to pledge their loyalty to the United States and to fight on their behalf, on the behalf of the United States. And little did he know that his prediction would come true in less than 20 years. In the next slide, shows a view of the Eatonville Lumber Company, where the owner recruited my uncle to play on the company baseball team. And in return, the company offered housing and employment. So in 1926, my dad and his brother started working in the mill, and they were receiving the princely sum of money of $30 a month. The Eatonville Lumber Company provided housing, which you can see in the far right-hand corner, and had a Japanese bathhouse, a community center, and a company store that was stocked with all the favored Japanese groceries. In the next slide, my father and mother were married at the beginning of the Great Depression. And the first member of our family was a little dog called Puggy. I was born in 1936, Kenji, and my mother and father felt relatively financially secure, despite the depression that was raging throughout the country. Within a few years, in 1939, my brother Jerry was born, and my third brother, Chester Jr., was born in 1941, just before the war. So now my parents, in the next slide, were living a very comfortable life before the war, with many friends, both Caucasian and Japanese. My dad had a thriving radio repair business, and we often took trips in our new car to the ocean. I remember picking strawberries at a local farm. There were ski trips to Mount Rainier, and even I remember a road trip to Portland, Oregon. So during this pre-war time in the late 1930s, the Sakura family had begun moving up the social economic ladder. So in the next slide, as was described, shortly after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, war hysteria and racial hatred toward the Japanese was spreading up and down the West Coast. But that hostility had not reached our small community in Eatonville, and life continued as normal. So in 1941, after Pearl Harbor, our family sent out our traditional Christmas card. My father, I remember, would come home every day from the mill for midday lunch. And I even had my kindergarten class photo taken while attending the elementary school nearby. And I should add that the elementary school class in an entire school was integrated. There were Japanese students in each one of the classes. So it was a very receptive community for the Japanese workers and their families. So as was described, there was a series of military orders, beginning with Executive Order 9066. And in March of 1942, there was a deadline set for those who wanted to move inland away from the war restriction area. And I remember my parents talking late at night about what to do. Should they leave their home in Eatonville and travel inland? But there was no assurance of housing or employment, so they decided to take their chances by staying in Eatonville. So in the next slide, this photo was taken in early 1942, just before the evacuation orders came. And it shows myself on the left with my brother Jerry and our family dog Puggy. And when the orders came, we had to give away everything in our household, the car, our household items, including giving away our dog Puggy. You asked what happened to Puggy. And years later, after the war, we learned that Puggy had waited over 10 years in the front yard of our friend's house for our return. But sadly enough, we never returned as a family to Eatonville, and Puggy had died of a broken heart. In the next slide, shows the order that came for our evacuation. And years ago, I talked to someone who witnessed our departure from Eatonville, getting on the bus, and he questioned an armed soldier that was guarding our group getting on the bus. And he was told in no uncertain terms that it was none of your business. There were no protests, no tears, just a silent farewell to our home in the mountains. This photograph shows our arrival at the camp, but before leaving Eatonville, the editor of the Eatonville Dispatch, Eugene Laren, who was a close friend of my father, asked him to act as his war correspondent and to send back reports to the hometown newspaper. And I believe that Eugene Laren is an unsung hero of the internment story. He was brave enough to publish my father's letters in the face of a torrent of anti-Japanese feelings. And I remember getting on the bus for the 45-minute ride from Eatonville to our temporary internment camp called Camp Harmony, which is located on the Washington State Fairgrounds. And I remember looking out the window and traveling down the long driveway lined with barbed wire. The barbed wire fence was as tall as the bus. And I can still see the masses of people with Asian faces pressed up against the fence, looking at the newcomers. So Chet began writing his dispatch from Camp Harmony at the fairgrounds in Puyallup. And I remember when we got off the bus, we were greeted again by armed guards. After being processed, and I was fingerprinted as a 6-year-old by the FBI. We were given army cots, mattress covers, and I remember filling those covers with straw. We were assigned to a horse stall where our family of 2 adults and 3 children lived. 3 children under the age of 6 lived. And I can still see my mother crouched in the back of the horse stall, trying to console my 3-year-old brother who was crying fitfully. And for days, I remember my brother could not be consoled and would cry for what seemed like hours until he finally, I can still hear his voice, which was a low, guttural, animal-like sound. So as we were told, in the summer of 1942, 10 internment camps, concentration camps, were being built in isolated areas of the country. In the next slide. You've seen this slide before, and in the middle of the slide is Minidoka, which was our ultimate destination. So in September 1942, we were taken by train to the Minidoka internment camp. It was a 30-hour trip made worse by the stifling conditions in the cars. The guards made us keep the windows shut and the shades drawn, and the heat in the cars, I can remember, were made worse by the toilets that were overflowing. But I remember opening the shades one night as we were creeping along somewhere in the high desert in Washington or Idaho, and I can still smell the sweet, cool evening air as it wafted into the car. So in the next slide, a government photographer took this photograph of the three boys arriving, and it's shown in the next slide. We arrived at our destination at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and after over 30 hours in semi-darkness, I can remember, I thought I was in the middle of the night. I wasn't adjusted to the bright Idaho sunlight. And an armed guard approached me, and I remember looking up at him, and he called me by my name. He said, "Hi, David." I was dumbfounded. I was astounded. How did he know my name? And as it turns out, we were all required to wear government issued name tags with our ID numbers. And he simply looked down and read my tag with my name on it and my number, 17643, C for child. But we were really, as a family, as a group, unprepared for the chaotic scene that greeted us at Minidoka. What we saw was a dystopian city of endless rows of tar paper barracks that stretched into clouds of dust hanging on the horizon. My father wrote about how dust would creep into every crevice, every crack, everywhere. It seemed like we had been condemned to an Orwellian world because the US government had found us, myself included, guilty of some unspecified charge. And perhaps the only charge I, as a 6-year-old, was guilty of was being born as a Japanese American. In the next slide, shows our home for the next 2 years. It was a large room in one of the barracks. And as we were told, the barracks were arranged into 33 blocks, and each block housed over 250 people. And our room address was Block 15, Building 8, Room E. And I was instructed by my mother never to forget 15-8E, for that was the only way I could find my way home through this maze. And even today, Kenji, at 86, I have reoccurring nightmares about being lost in a maze of a foreign city and not being able to find my way home. So the impact of the internment on a child stays with you for decades. And this room was only the size of a standard hotel room, except, as you recall, there was no running water, no toilet facilities. And besides the army cots, the only piece of furniture was that pot-bellied stove in the corner that kept us warm in the wintertime. And I remember waking up at night and seeing flecks of snow seeping through the window and the cold stove burning red hot, keeping our room warm against the frigid Idaho winter. And I wonder how my mother was able to cope with the 2 young boys in such close quarters with an unguarded coal burning stove standing red hot in the corner. When we arrived in the camps, the sanitary conditions were primitive at best. For 3 months, there was no hot water, no toilet facility, only an outhouse. By Thanksgiving, there were communal toilets and showers, but there was no privacy for men and women. So my mother was afraid of letting me alone in the men's shower room. And she would often make me take a shower with her. And even as a child, I was so humiliated, embarrassed, standing there amongst a group of naked women of all shapes and ages. You mothers, if you were in the audience, you can imagine what your son's response would be taking a shower with you. He'd probably never take a shower for years. There was a widespread use of cesspools underneath the units, and they provided a means of disposing wastewater from our barracks rooms, the water that was used to clean my brother's diapers. But the cesspools proved to be a public health hazard. And I remember one day my brother coming home after falling into a neighbor's cesspool, and the sight of him and all the debris dripping off of him was horrific. But his smell was unforgettable. In the next slide is what I consider a US government propaganda film, photograph. Let me give you a little bit of background to this photograph. First of all, it's the photograph of my dad carried my youngest brother, Chet Jr. I'm standing in front of my mother, my dad with his three brothers. On the left is my uncle Chip with his baby, Freddie, that was born in the camps. His wife, Alice, brother, was in fact at this very same moment a German prisoner of war as a member of the US Army, and she was incarcerated in the concentration camp in America. My mother, my two uncles, and my grandmother. This photograph was taken in commemoration of my dad and his three brothers responding to the call for volunteering to the US Army. My dad was 38 at the time, and my mother adamantly begged him not to go and leave her struggling with her three young boys. But nevertheless, he left in the summer of 1942, and we would only see him sporadically until the end of the war. In the next photograph, at the same time, I was going to school, went to first grade and second grade, and I recall standing there pledging allegiance to the flag of the United States, for which it stands, behind barbed wire, and my father in the US Army. In the next slide, it was a happy day when my father came home from basic training. I recall him telling me before he left that I was now the man of the house and I should take care of my mother and the two young boys. And I really took his advice seriously. And in retrospect, I can see how this was an impossible task for a 7-year-old. In the next slide shows a real photograph of my family. Dirty clothes, dust on the shoes, hand-me-down clothes, barbed wire, barracks in the background. And the only thing we could find to take a photograph on was a pile of debris, a pile of rocks. This is a true picture of the internment. And years later, my father wrote in a letter, quote, "The intervening years after leaving for service until the end of the war was a struggle for Agnes, my mother. And I remember my mother trying to maintain a sense of normalcy under these almost impossible circumstances. And on one occasion, she would succumb to the stress and anxiety that was endemic in camp. And she had to spend at least 1 week in the camp hospital suffering from what was called exhaustion. This photograph really shows the emotional and the reality of life in a concentration camp. But on a happier note, I should say that my mother would take us on picnics in order to maintain a sense of normalcy. She would pack a lunch and she would take us through the barbed wire to the rattlesnake infested sagebrush, to the barbed wire fence that you can see in the upper photograph. And we would have a picnic in the shadow of the watchtowers. In the next slide, we went on a vacation to a Bible camp in Sun Valley, Idaho. And this trip was organized by Reverend Emery Andrews, who was the pastor of my grandfather's Japanese Baptist church. It was there I learned to swim, and I wrote a letter to my father, who was training in the 442nd, and excitingly telling him my great achievement. But let me share with you my fondest memory as a child in the camps. It was early spring in 1944 when I was invited to a play date with a classmate. Her name was Betsy Davidson. Betsy had blonde curly hair and blue eyes, and she was the daughter of the associate director of the camp, Eugene Davidson. And they were from, I remember, El Paso, Texas. Betsy and I played all together all afternoon in the front yard of her real house, not a barracks, but in a real house located in the administrative section of the camp. It was a memorable experience of pure childish pleasure. And I sometimes think about Betsy nearly 80 years later, and I wonder if she even remembers having a play date with an awkward, nearsighted Japanese American boy from Eatonville, Washington. In the next slide, in the summer of 1944, after being interned in Minidoka for almost 2 years, we were given an indefinite leave and to travel to the Midwest, Wisconsin, under the sponsorship of the American Home Baptist Mission Society. We were given a one-way ticket to Wisconsin, $25 cash to cover expenses. And once again, we were refugees in our country. Late in the evening on that first day, while traveling on a crowded troop train, my mother got off at the station in Cheyenne, Wyoming, to buy sandwiches for the boys. And as she was making her purchases, she saw to her horror that the train was leaving the station with her 3 boys on board, my brother, myself. She ran desperately down the platform, climbed safely aboard the last train. But I still think about what could have happened if she had not gotten back on that train. What could have happened to us, the fate of 3 boys traveling eastbound on a troop train somewhere into the night? Well, in the next slide, on a happier note, after several false starts, our family was admitted into public housing in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. The housing project was called Park Lawn, and it was the crown jewel of the last socialist mayor in the United States. His name was Frank Zeidler, and he felt that everyone should be helped, and it was everyone's responsibility to help those who are disadvantaged. It was a wonderful place to grow up. The rent was subsidized. It was $20 a month. And soon after the end of the war, my dad came home And shortly thereafter, guess what? My third brother, Bruce, joined the family. So it was a happy time. We were all together now. And I was no longer the head of the family. My dad was home. And for the second time, the Sakura family was beginning to climb up the social economic ladder. So let's fast forward. In the next slide, we heard about the redress movement and the signing of the Civil Liberties Act of 1988. And I can see there one of the attendees was Norm Mineta, who recently passed away, and he was a driving force in the passage of the Civil Liberties Act of 1988, and was a lion in the Japanese community. In the next slide, the redress movement began and led, as you heard, to the signing of the legislation, but also in a letter that I received along with a check for $20,000. And I love reading the part of that letter which said, "We can never fully right the wrongs of the past, but we can make a clear stand for justice and recognize that serious injustices were done to Japanese Americans during World War II." When students ask me, what do I value more, the letter or the redress payment of $20,000? And without missing a beat, I think the letter is the most important. So finally, in 2001, President Bill Clinton established by proclamation the Minidoka Internment National Monument. And every year there's a pilgrimage for the dwindling number of survivors and their family and grandchildren to commemorate our time in America's concentration camp. So what have we learned? We learned that democracy can be fragile. And there are forces all around us that threaten its very fabric. And the internment story, I believe, could be like a canary in the coal mine that's warning us today of what can happen when evil forces and racial hatred can take over our thinking and our understanding of those who are different from us. I think it's a canary in a coal mine, and we should listen to the warnings. But finally, this internment story, rather than talking about numbers and detail, it's really a story of personal triumph over adversity by a minority group. And I hope in closing that my story, the family story, the internment story, will encourage all of you in the audience to show empathy to those who are refugees and struggling with displacement, even as they occur today throughout the world. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for sharing your family history, David, and again, also Kenji, thank you so much for joining us today, even though we know you're recovering as well. I want to just acknowledge that we wanted to have a Q&A session for the audience and the folks on Zoom. But I also recognize that the event was supposed to end at 6 p.m., but we had so many technical glitches that, so I'll make it optional at this point. If anybody wants to stay on, by all means, please feel free to stay on, and if you have any questions, we will do a Q&A, but if you have to leave, we completely understand as well. So I'll open the floor to the audience. If anyone has questions, yes?
Yeah, so I'd like to hear what David, or what you attribute the resiliency of you and your whole family, despite going through this terrible experience. Yeah, it sounds like, you know, your family was, yeah, just incredibly resilient.
Well, I think Kenji, you'll agree with me. We had no choice. There were no options. It's either go or be shot. So it's not bravery per se. It's just it's extinction. It's the only option we had. And I think there is something in the Japanese culture that requires you, that's almost part of your DNA, to endure hardship. And I think it's common to all ethnic groups, all newly arrived refugees in this country, immigrants, to endure hardship. We're so used to a soft life in suburbia, with the internet, with warmth and clothing. But think about all the people in the world that have to endure, even as we speak, with no electricity, no lights, no food, and danger. So this is not unusual. It's not unique. But we as a racial group, had to go through circumstances that were not part of the democratic ideal. And I think that's the story that we should always be on guard against those who spread doubt, hatred, and fear, and try to destroy the concept of democracy, because it's the only one that we have.
In your experience, I want to know why good people didn't do very much, or if you think they did enough, but they were overwhelmed. So in all these situations, of fear and hatred and xenophobia, there's always at least a sizable element, hopefully, in society that will speak out or fight against such injustices. Did you see that?
Well, as I mentioned in my presentation, I think of the editor of the Eatonville Dispatch as being one of those brave individuals who stood up against the torrent of racial attitudes, and to let the public know what was going on in the camps by publishing my father's letters. I think he was an unsung hero in this story. And in reality, it just takes one person at a time to stand up against tyranny. So and one person develops into two people. And this story, the internment story, is made up of many good people who provided support, the religious leaders, Father Tibasar from the Marinold brothers, the Reverend Emery Andrews, who moved his family from Seattle. There were many, many people who were supportive of our family and those who were interned.
Thank you.
Oh, yes, we have a statement.
I just want to thank you very much for sharing your story, because as you said, it's very important that people hear the story from those who actually lived it. So thank you for sharing it.
Well, I think the girls, and I forgot your names, you did a fantastic, that's the best presentation of an overview of the internment. I was just absolutely blown away, and my kudos go out to you. I think you did a fantastic job. But my presentation is at ground zero, at the ground level, and from the eyes of a 6-year-old. So remember, it's a child's view of the internment. So my experiences aren't at going to dances and playing baseball, but my experiences included having a play date with somebody from the camps.
Oh, yes. We wanted to offer Kenji, who was originally supposed to be the guest speaker. Kenji, you also were at Minidoka when you were 4, and you're meeting now David Sakura for the first time, and both of you were there at the same time, and you guys did not actually get the chance to ever meet. And this is your first time meeting as both survivors of Minidoka camp. Is there anything that you wanted to share, Kenji?
Hello,
Hi, Kenji.
this is Kenji Ema. That was a very moving story. In fact, I lived in the same camp that Sasaki-san's lived in. And one of the things I kept wondering is, you guys are so young, and I think about age and memory, and what does it mean for a young person who's never seen this before or never heard it before? Someplace in their lives they have heard this, because this is a classic story going back to the Greeks about the, if you will, the side effects of war. The most famous is the Trojan women story, where the consequences of the war is especially hard on children and women. And every time I see the play Trojan Women at the end, I have to cry, because at the end, the women are being shipped to Greece from Troy as slaves to a destination they don't know what will be, like going to the camp. What will be next? Will they send us to Japan? Will they do this? All kinds of things. But the point is, the theme is universal. And if you are a Christian or a Jew or a Muslim, there is one thing that sort of enters all those religions, is to care and think about others in need. If I'm not mistaken, among Muslims, that must be a very powerful message. So when you're young and you don't experience much of these things, I guess you have to listen to old people. In Yiddish, I would be called an alter cocker, a complaining old man. But there are some virtues to listening to what old people say. I think as old persons, we must be humble about what we say, because it is our experience and not everyone's. I just realized last year my cousin died. I'm the last of 19 people in my family that's alive, that remembers. So there aren't very many people like me who can remember. So if you can use us to have discussions to memory, more the better. And we're, I think, willing in that process, because it's in this process where we grow, rather than being ethnocentric we learn to love others. And it seems to me that is a fundamental tenet of religion. So at any rate, I have personal experience. Like I was 4 actually. So a 4-year-old, can you imagine what they know? How can they conceptualize? Well, that's maybe for another time to tell, but I will say this. Even if you can't remember everything, one of the vestiges of life is feeling. And one of the feelings I came away from camp was fear. That I couldn't, even as growing up, I couldn't articulate it, but I know the fear was there because I had nightmares every night for years based on fear. And the same was, the dream was the same, the fear was the same. And I got up and I always sweated because I said, gee, I need to take a shower. You know,
Amazing.
but you know, it's hard to trivialize another person's fear and experience. But I think one of the things to do is to listen to what happens to people, to understand the collateral cost of conflict and war. And so here we are, 2 altar gawkers complaining, in a manner of speaking, so to speak.
Well,
Anyway,
actually,
thank
we
you.
have a third. We have Suki, Terada Ports, who is also here and in person. She is a Japanese American who lived in Harlem, grew up in Harlem during the incarceration period. And I think it's really an honor to be with you in person.
Thank you. I just wanted to share something with you, a bit of New York history that I think you probably don't know, is that Dr. Iwamoto, who was the Japanese doctor who served the Japanese community and all of our Japanese American mothers, delivered babies in Harlem. We were all born in Harlem because the white hospitals in New York would not permit him to deliver babies in the white hospitals. So we were all born in Lutheran Hospital in Harlem. So in 1934, it was not after World War, the bombing of Pearl Harbor, but it was early in the 1930s that he was the victim of the prejudice here in New York, and he had to deliver all his babies in Harlem. And so I was born in Harlem, as was my mother, who was not allowed to leave Manhattan because she was under house arrest because she was born in Japan, and the Americans would not let her leave Manhattan because she was possibly going to do some spying. And so those of you who don't know the history of the Japanese Americans here in New York, it's very different than what you might consider was camp, that she was in house arrest, but also that all of the Japanese Americans who were born here in New York from the 1930, when my sister was born here, through my 1934 and all the others through 1945 until after the end of World War II, we were all born in Harlem because we all had to be delivered by Dr. Iwamoto in Lutheran Hospital in Harlem because the white hospitals would not let him deliver in those hospitals. So it's a different history for some of us than you really realize has happened in New York. And during World War II, when my mother was under house arrest and she couldn't leave Manhattan, there were things that we didn't know, my sister and I didn't know why she would not visit us at summer camp because they would not let her leave Manhattan. And we just thought she didn't love us the way American parents love their children and visited at summer camp. And, you know, there are all kinds of things that went on that people don't know, and that all of the Japanese Americans were born in Harlem from 1930 through 1945.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Suki. And also, we did not recognize the Japanese Americans who were actually in Hawaii during that time period. They were still allowed to work on the plantation. They weren't incarcerated at all. So the Japanese Americans, and I learned this from him, so we can see that the Japanese Americans were treated differently in different parts of the US during this time.
Sure, because my father was born in Hawaii, but he was allowed to work in Manhattan. But he was not, you know, he was no longer considered Hawaiian. He was a New Yorker.
Okay, everybody, thank you so much for. Thank you so much, David, Sakura, Kenji, Suki, for being a part of this amazingly special event. And we hope that we can do this every year. This program was hosted by the Bitter Melon and in partnership with the Hudson Valley Books for Humanity and the Ima family and the Sakura family. Thank you so much, everybody, for your participation and for putting up with all of our technology issues. We have some cookies that Tim has brought for after effects, if you would like. And we will be closing down the Zoom. So everyone on Zoom, thank you so much for joining us.